specific way, then really, are you worshiping or are you just going through the motions? I think it was Matthew, what's his name, Cookie, the singer? Matthew West, who says, I don't want to just go through the motions. I want to be true to what I'm doing. I want to be true to what I'm saying. I want to be true to everything that I'm giving you. And so if I'm going to worship God, I have to worship him in spirit and in truth. And so David was essentially saying, I'm going to bless the Lord with everything that I have within me. And the reason why I'm blessing the Lord with everything that I have within me is, first of all, let's look at his name. We're simply recapping what we talked about last week. His name is essentially his reputation. Everything that he's already done, he's made a name for himself. He's made a reputation for himself, and that reputation is all about loving me. Right? And so I'm going to give God everything that I have. Now, we move on to verse 2. And in verse 2, it says, bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits. So the question is, exactly what are the benefits? Now listen, David names a few, but David doesn't name them all. Hence the word, hence the phrase says, and all of his benefits, right? There are some benefits that David is not naming, and some of those benefits are personal to you. Does that make sense? If you have a personal relationship with God, some of those benefits are simply personal to you and you alone. But yet and still, David says, I'm going to bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all of his benefits. My question to you is, well, let me put this. Is it really possible to forget the benefits of God?
Yes.
Why do you say that?
Because situations and circumstances can cloud hinder our worship.
Okay. All right. Well, then is that really worshiping in spirit and in truth then?
No.
Okay. I was looking at that verse and I was thinking to myself, how can you actually forget all of the many benefits that God has for us, right? How could that be even an option? Right? And I thought to myself, after I think of one, it seems to me they all start cascading and saying this one, and oh yeah, I forgot all about that one, and oh this one, and oh yeah, this one, and this one, and this one. And David is essentially saying, I'm going to bless the Lord, and I'm not going to forget any of the benefits that I receive from him. So what are those benefits? If you notice that verse ends with a colon, right? A colon basically represents a list is coming, right? That's English language, am I correct, Cookie? A colon essentially says that I'm about to lay down a list for you. And that's what David is about to do. So the very first thing David says is, one of the benefits of worshiping God, why God deserves our worship, one of those benefits is, as David puts it, who forgiveth all thine iniquities. I want somebody to look up the word iniquity for me in their phone, please. Iniquities.
Going too fast.
Okay. Iniqu. What?
Immoral or grossly unfair behavior.
Amoral or grossly unfair behavior. Right? Now, if I use the definition that I have in my Hebrew book from that Hebrew word, it means a depraved action or a perversity. And essentially what David is saying is he forgives all of my depraved acts, all of my perversities. Here's the thing. David doesn't specify that there are certain things that God forgives and there are certain things that he does not. David essentially says, he uses the word all. That means that everything that I've done wrong, God has forgiven me for. Right? Every wrong act, and so this is what I don't understand about people who say, how can God forgive me of that? Essentially, David says there is no sin that God has not forgiven. And David is essentially saying, and I'm not going to keep y'all long, David says, he has forgiven me of every depraved act, every perverse thing that I've done, every dirty deed that I've committed, all of those things that I've done underhandedly, all of those things I've done to other people, everything, every time that I slapped his hand away, every time that I told him to leave me alone, God has forgiven me for all of it. Right? Now, we said God made a name for himself last week. We said that all of the other gods that we've been dealing with, God is the only one that had some skin in the game, we said, right? He's the only one that actually put something down on us, right? Made a, an investment in us, and that he gave his son to die for our sins. So God is the only, of all of the quote-unquote gods in this world, God is the only one that actually sacrificed something for us. As opposed to all the other gods saying, we have to sacrifice something for them. Y'all understand that, right? And so, when we look at David saying he forgives me of all of my iniquities, we see that God is a God that says, listen, I don't care what you've done. I forgive you for that. Unlike all of the other ones who say, work it out yourself. And you'll never be good enough, but work it out yourself. But David doesn't stop there. And then he says, who healeth all thy diseases. Now I want us to look at something specific here. If we're going down a list of the benefits that God lays out before us to choose him, the very first one was dealing with our souls itself, right? The forgiveness of our sins. Remember, we said the most important thing to God about us is our soul itself, right? We said that's the part that he put in us, and that's the part that he wants to return to him. Does that make sense? And so that's the part that he deals with first. And so the very first thing on David's list is dealing with the soul. Now, the second thing he says is, he healeth all thy diseases. Right? So now we look at that, and we can look at that in a physical sense. That David says, all of these physical ailments that I have, all of these diseases that I have physically, God heals. But let me tell you something. David uses the word all. Right? Do you know that there are spiritual diseases? Do you know that if you let doubt stay within you so long that it festers and grows and soon takes over everything you believe in? If you let that lack of faith or trust fester so long, it gets to a point where everything you see is untrustworthy. Y'all understand that? So when David talks about healing diseases, we're not just simply talking about these physical ailments that we have, but we're talking about physical and spiritual diseases that may occur. God heals our physical diseases, as many can attest to that. But God also heals our spiritual diseases as well. That doubt, God dealt with. That faith, that lack of faith, God deals with. That lack of trust, God deals with. And he heals us from all manner of disease. And I'm almost done. Then David says, who redeemeth thy life from destruction. Y'all know what redeem means, right? Yes. All right. So one of the benefits, let me recap. The first one is forgiveness. The next one is healing, both physically and spiritually. And this third one is one of the benefits is redemption. we go back to the same thing of saying that God forgives every sin, but not only does God forgive every sin, by what means does God forgive every sin? By what means does God forgive every sin? Is that not a good question? Is that a bad question? Yeah. Why you say it like that? Through Jesus Christ, God forgives every sin. And Jesus Christ came and did what? He gave his life. He did, essentially, he paid for our salvation, right? He redeemed us, right? And so therefore, one of the benefits is this salvation that we enjoy. Listen, if we put it in context, God told Adam and Eve, if you can have every fruit in this garden, but the fruit of this one tree you cannot eat. If you eat it, you shall surely die. The law was laid down, right? God said this, and that was it. Now, if we had an unforgiving God, he could have said, well, I told you guys not to eat that fruit. You ate it anyway, and so therefore, you made your bed, now you sleep in it. Right? But God, on the other hand, the God that we're dealing with, is a God that is of love, a God that is able to forgive, a God that has put a certain amount of, put an investment in us and said, these are my people, and I cannot let them perish. And so since he has said, I cannot let them perish, I want them to be with me. Since God has this love that we can't understand for us, instead of God saying, they made their bed and now they have to sleep in it, God devises a plan to save us. That alone, salvation alone, makes God worthy of our praise. But if I'm going to be completely honest with you, because God saved us, in our mind that makes him worthy, but let's be honest. God is God. There is none like him. There is none that can do what he can do. Before the beginning of time, he was. Yes. Sister Sheila likes to say, I am, and that means I am of this and I am of that. Essentially, God has been here. He has created us. He has created this world. He's the one who commands every breath that we take. So even if God hadn't saved us, yes, the fact of the matter is he's worthy, yes, yes, and deserves our praise and our worship simply because, yes, he is.
That's right.
If I want to be completely honest with you, he doesn't have to lay out a resume at all for us. He doesn't have to plead his case as far as why you should worship him. In all actuality, until you can do what he can do, he deserves your worship. Amen. And I don't figure you can do what he can do anytime soon. Come on, man. So in the meantime, God deserves our worship just because he is. But David says, let me lay down a few things for you. And so David goes into redemption and how he saved us from destruction. And I thought about that for a minute, and I said, in every case, every day of my life, I have been trying my hardest to destroy myself. And every day, God saves me from my own destruction. Now, if we're talking commitment, if we're talking about a committed God, that every day, I play this game called Lemmings. Have you ever heard this game? It's a, you know this game, Brenda? Why y'all don't play? Y'all don't play no games on your phone?
We play games on that.
Okay. There's this game called Lemmings on my phone. And what these lemmings, they're so dumb. There are all kinds of traps. You're trying to get the lemming from the place that they fell out, they launched, to their home. right? And in between the place that they came out and their home are all these traps. And lemmings are so stupid that they just keep walking. And if there's a trap in front of them, they're just going to walk right into it. So my job as the game player is to make ways for them to get around these traps, right? The whole point of the game is to direct a good path for the lemmings to go to get to their home safely. And every now and then as I'm playing this game, there's always something that slips by and a couple of lemmings die. They walk right off the cliff, right? Every now and then, as I look at this game board on the phone, it's something that I always miss. And they are always walking just blindly along and end up in some trap and die. And I thought about that with us. As we go through this life, God is constantly covering up the traps, stopping us from falling into the pit or falling off the cliff or making some way for us to get to where we're trying to go. And every day we consistently want to fall in that trap. David says this, one of the benefits is that he redeemed us from destruction. And here's the thing, he redeems us every day. Why does he redeem us every day? Because every day we sin. And every day we have to ask God, Lord, I'm sorry. Please forgive me for that one. And every day, Jesus at the right hand of the Father has to intercede and say, yes, Lord, he did that, but I died for that. Look at the blood, Lord. I made the sacrifice just for him. And he's constantly pleading his case. And guess what? Along with that, every day, the accuser is accusing us of something else we messed up on. And so therefore, we face destruction every day. And God redeems us every day. But David says this, who crowneth thee with loving kindness and tender mercies. Caleb, loving kindness again?
Tenderness and consideration towards others.
Tenderness and consideration towards others. He crowns us with tenderness and consideration towards others. Tell me something. When you see a king with a crown, what's your first impression?
Royalty.
Royalty. What else?
Privilege.
Privilege. What else? Power. What else?
Arrogant.
Huh?
Arrogant.
That's not a good one. I want.
Unforgiving.
Okay, arrogance. Fine. Huh?
Well,
Wealth.
unforgiving.
Unforgiving. Why you say that?
Unforgiving.
Okay, fine.
Stern.
Okay. Anybody say he a king? Does anybody say he a king?
Ruling.
You see a crown, he must be a king.
That's obvious. I thought you said king.
You must be.
Well, I did. I said, but that's the obvious first answer, right? You see a crown, he must be a king, right? Oh, okay. The crown identifies him as something, right?
Right.
In this particular instance, David says he crowns my head with loving kindness. This identifies me as a person who is. What you do with the definition?
I put it on.
A person who is tender and of loving care.
And consideration towards others.
A person who is tender and has consideration towards others. How many mean Christians y'all have met in your day, in your lifetime?
A lot.
Well, some of them Christians are ooh. Especially, and I'm gonna go ahead and call them out. Especially them Southern Baptists, them real hardcore. You gonna go straight to hell, right?
Right.
But in all actuality, when people see us, they should identify us with loving kindness, right? They should identify us as tender people. What's the word? I can't.
Kindness.
Yes. Keep it up.
I got it.
Okay, what does it say?
Tenderness and consideration towards others.
They should identify us as a person who's tender and considerate of others. And yet, when they identify us, what's the first thing they say?
Like them Christians.
Like them Christians. Them Christians, they hypocrites. They hateful people. Sending everybody to hell, blah, blah, blah. Judgmental. There are all of these negative connotations when they don't see that crown. And that's the first thing they should, like I said, whenever you see a king, the first thing you identify, you see that crown, you know he's a king, right? But he also says, with loving kindness and tender mercies. Listen, God is a God that gives us, the Bible says, we get brand new mercies every morning, right? Peter asked Jesus, how many times should I forgive my brother? And Jesus said, let me see if y'all got some Bible reading people here. What's that, Marky?
He said a big number times something. 7
times 70.
70 times 7 in a given day. Anybody do the math?
Yeah, that's 490 times in a day.
490 times in a day. Jocelyn, you deserve from me 490 forgivenesses a day. Right? Now, unfortunately for you, I ain't been keeping track of the numbers. But if I was, I still don't think I would get to 490 times in one day. And that's just Jocelyn. I gotta give Jocelyn 490. I gotta give Marky 490, Brenda 490, and Daddy. That's too much to keep track of. I'll be walking around with a tally book saying, that's 1, that's 2, that's 3. And I got to do that for everybody. The point is, God is about being merciful. God is about showing mercy when people don't deserve mercy. Because let's be honest, if I'm going to strictly talk about me, I don't deserve God's mercy, especially not every day. Yeah. Some of those days I did that stuff knowing it was totally against God. Right? But God is merciful enough to show me mercy anyway. That crown that he's placed on our head, people should identify us with loving kindness and with tender mercies. Essentially, what David is saying is, he's made me something different than what I used to be. And in making me something different than what I used to be, now I have this crown where I used to be a judgmental, mean, unforgiving person. God has now changed me into something like him. Another benefit, I become something new. Right? And then he says, who satisfied my mouth with good things, so that thy youth is renewed like the eagles. I asked a question about that word renewed. Who did I ask that of? Somebody tell me the definition of renew.
Refresh. What you asking?
On the top of your head. Somebody, y'all know I'm going to ask. Renew. Renew. Okay, I like done over.
Resume after an interruption. That's what it says.
No, I don't like that. That ain't the one.
That's the diction.
Renew. Something about replace, repair.
Clean slate.
Resume.
Yeah, that's what he said.
Reestablish.
Reestablish.
Repeat.
Repeat.
Refresh.
Refresh.
Start over.
Start over. I like all of those. All of those.
Become new.
Become new. Who satisfy thy mouth with good things, so that thy youth is renewed like the eagles. Essentially, if we're looking at the word as it is, when we consume something, good things, how do we feel about it? If we're talking about just food, for example, we have this term called comfort food. That regardless of what happens during the day, we have this particular food that we'll eat that makes us feel better. That make sense? And it's all basically psychological, right? Really. That food is probably the worst thing for you. But for some reason, it makes us feel better, right? And we identify what we eat with how we feel. Does that make sense?
Right.
So David specifically says here that satisfies my mouth with something good, right? Satisfies my mouth with good things so that thy youth is renewed like the eagles. Essentially, forget about the mouth and let's look at our lives as we run this Christian race. At some point in time, it seems, well, this y'all gonna say I'm. At some point in time, it gets to a point where it seems monotonous, tiring, makes us weary, right? And God always at some point gives us something to make us have a renewed strength to continue on in this race. One of the benefits that David is talking about is that in this Christian race, God is always showing me something new to make me regain my strength, to make me continue a little further. I'm not so bogged down in this Christian race that I'm running it and I'm all by myself, but God always seems to show up and do something that gives me a renewed strength or a renewed sense of things. It all of a sudden repairs or replaces that old drab stuff that I've been doing, and now I look at this race and I can see going further. David essentially says, "To satisfy my mouth with good things, so that thy youth is renewed like the eagles." So that now I have a new strength in this race. Y'all heard the verse, "They that wait on the Lord shall renew their strength, mount up with wings of eagles." There you go. The fact of the matter is, in this Christian race, sometimes it gets hard. But God is always renewing us. The benefits of worshiping God. The benefits, why God deserves our worship. And listen, David's laid down some of these things, but ultimately, as we get further down in this verse, you'll find out God deserves our worship just because he's God. Nothing more, nothing less. God deserves our worship because in all actuality, we're beneath him. And because we're beneath him, well, we should worship him. That makes sense? I watched this show, y'all heard me talk about it, Stargate. And on Stargate, there's these little worms. And they're called Goa'uld. They're just worms. But these worms, it's sci-fi, people. And these worms, they get into wrap around your vertebrae and they start controlling your body, right? And so because they have a higher technology, they call themselves gods. And they enslave everybody and tell everybody that they should worship them because they are gods. The problem is when you actually see what they really look like, there's something you can step on and squash with your foot. My point is they have an inflated sense of themselves, much like we do. We have an inflated sense of ourselves in that we think that we are doing this all by ourselves. We think that we don't need God. I've heard people say this time and time again, that I've done this all by myself. I don't need God. We have an inflated sense of ourselves in thinking that we are the end all, the be all, and that there is nothing we can't do, but we forget that the only reason we've succeeded this far is because there is a God. Because in all actuality, if God said it's time for you to come home today, there's nothing you can do to stop it.
Amen.
So in all actuality, God deserves our worship because he has control of it all. He created me. Had it not been for the breath of life he blew in me, I wouldn't even be able to exist. So why does God deserve our worship? He deserves our worship just because he's God.
That's right.
God bless you.